a former head of state, living in comfortable exile, quietly working to destabilize the very country he once ruled. This is not a Cold War thriller. This is not a relic of the 20th century. According to Burkina Faso's military government, this is what happened in the months following the ousting of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. And what happened next signals something that analysts across the African continent are only beginning to fully process. Because for decades, the unspoken arrangement was simple. You rule until you're removed. You flee. You live, well, somewhere in West Africa or Europe. And if your backers still have interests in the country you left behind, you make yourself useful, quietly, from a distance. It was a system that kept post-colonial politics in a kind of managed chaos. Reliable enough to exploit, unstable enough to control. But that arrangement, if what Ouagadougou is now claiming holds any weight, may be facing its most direct challenge yet. This is the story of a 20-something junta leader, an alleged exile plot, a region being redrawn by political will, and an economic shockwave originating thousands of miles away in the Strait of Hormuz that is now pressing down on some of the most vulnerable economies in the world. What is unfolding in and around Burkina Faso right now is not an isolated drama. It is a data point in a much larger, much more consequential transformation, one that will define African sovereignty politics for the generation to come. To understand why any of this matters, you have to start with the coup that almost nobody predicted would last. In September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power from Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, himself a military officer who had taken power only 8 months earlier. The imagery was jarring even by the region's standards. A coup within a coup, executed by a soldier who was, at the time, 34 years old. The international community issued its standard statements of concern. The African Union expressed its standard disapproval. And most analysts assumed what usually follows: a transitional arrangement, foreign pressure, a gradual normalization back toward whatever passed for the previous order. That is not what happened. Traoré moved quickly and with ideological conviction. He expelled French forces. He terminated the military cooperation agreement with Paris. He pivoted toward Russia, toward Mali's military government, toward a language of Pan-African resistance that had not been heard at this register from a sitting head of state in decades. He referenced Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987, who had become a symbol of uncompromising sovereignty, not as a historical footnote, but as an operational framework. Portraits of Sankara appeared alongside Traorés at rallies. The imagery was deliberate. The message was unmistakable. But symbols alone do not govern a country, and Burkina Faso, even before the coups, was in a state of profound crisis. Jihadist insurgencies linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates had consumed entire regions. Millions had been displaced. The economy was fractured. Aid pipelines, many of them Western, were being cut or complicated by the new political direction. Traoré was making enemies faster than he was building infrastructure. And the question hanging over Ouagadougou, the question that his critics raised loudly and his supporters dismissed just as loudly, was whether this was genuine transformation or ideological performance under fire. Then came the allegations about Damiba. Burkina Faso's government has claimed, and this is critical to hold carefully, that its deposed predecessor did not simply disappear into the quiet of exile. The narrative being advanced by Traoré's administration is that Damiba, operating from outside the country, was involved in activities aimed at destabilizing the government from within, that the former junta leader was not a passive exile, but an active participant in efforts to undermine the current administration. The specifics, as is common in such allegations, have not been fully placed in the public domain with verifiable documentation. But the political weight of the accusation is not diminished by that ambiguity. What makes this particular claim significant, and here is where you'll want to pay close attention, is not the accusation itself. Accusations between rival factions in post-coup politics are not unusual. What is significant is what is alleged to have followed. According to accounts emerging from Burkina Faso's political circles, Traoré's government did not respond to this threat with silence or internal suppression alone. It is reported that Ouagadougou applied diplomatic and intelligence pressure across the sub-region, including toward Togo, the country where Damiba had been residing. That resulted in Lomé taking visible steps in response to those concerns. If accurate, this represents something that has rarely, if ever, been documented in the post-coup politics of the Sahel. A sitting junta leader, rather than absorbing destabilization from exiled predecessors as a condition of political life, pushed back regionally and reportedly got results. Countries in the neighborhood responded. That is a departure from the norm, a significant one. To appreciate why, consider the historical baseline. The pattern across much of West and Central Africa for the past several decades has followed a remarkably consistent script. A leader is removed by coup, by election loss, sometimes by death. If by coup, the ousted figure typically departs to a neighboring state or a former colonial power. From that position, with access to networks, finances, and in many cases the continued sympathy of external backers, the exiled leader becomes a node of opposition, not always through direct violence, often through financing, through intelligence sharing, through maintaining political structures that function as a shadow government in waiting. The host country, for a mixture of reasons, regional solidarity, economic incentive, pressure from the same external powers, tend to look the other way. The implicit message to sitting governments across the region was always the same. When you fall, this is your safety net. And to those who might remove a sitting government, the man you remove will not disappear. He will be protected. He will have options. Traore, if the reported sequence of events is accurate, declined to operate within that framework. He treated the exile not as an accepted geopolitical fact, but as a security threat to be neutralized through regional diplomacy. He, in effect, demanded that the norms of the old system no longer apply, and demanded it with enough force that a neighboring government apparently complied. Is this a strategic move, or the beginning of a larger shift in how the Sahel's political class treats the exile system? That is a question worth sitting with, because the implications extend well beyond Burkina Faso. If other governments in the region, particularly those led by military administrations in Mali and Niger, both of whom have aligned politically with Traore's government under the alliance of Sahel states, adopt similar postures, the entire architecture of the exile system begins to corrode. Exiled former leaders lose their security guarantees. Host countries face pressure. External backers, who relied on exiled figures as instruments of policy, find those instruments compromised. The chessboard does not look the same. This is not a small thing. The ability to remove and replace leadership through the exile mechanism, to maintain influence over a country even after losing formal control, has been a cornerstone of how external powers, particularly France, maintained structural leverage over Francophone Africa for decades. It is part of what scholars of African politics call the neo-colonial system's maintenance architecture. You don't have to keep troops in the presidential palace if the person you put their nose, that crossing you means losing your protection when the next coup comes. Traore's generation and the political current he represents appears to be making a calculated decision to dismantle that architecture, not through speeches alone, but through operational choices that carry real consequences for the individuals involved. Now here is where the narrative gets more complicated and more honest. None of what Traore is attempting is without cost, and none of it is without risk. Burkina Faso remains one of the most fragile states in the world. The jihadist insurgency has not retreated. It has, by several accounts, continued to advance even as the government shifted its security partnerships. The humanitarian situation in the country's north and east remains severe, with significant portions of the population facing acute food insecurity. The Russian security presence, through Wagner Group's successor formations, has brought its own complications, including credible reports of human rights violations that have been documented by international organizations and reported by journalists operating at significant personal risk. There is a version of the Traore story that is genuinely transformational, a young leader breaking the neo-colonial cycle, building regional alliances on terms of sovereignty, and refusing the exile safety net that kept his predecessors compliant. And there is another version, a military government using the language of Pan-Africanism to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and deflect accountability for deteriorating security conditions on the ground. Both versions are in place simultaneously. That is the honest assessment. And any serious analysis of what is happening in Burkina Faso has to hold both without collapsing into either pure celebration or pure condemnation. What happens next, particularly whether Traore can translate political symbolism into measurable improvements in security and economic stability, will determine which version of this story history ultimately records. And then, just as that internal reckoning is deepening, the world delivered another shock from an entirely different direction. In the past several weeks, tensions in the Middle East have escalated in ways that are reverberating far beyond the region of their origin. Disruptions in and around the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, have sent fuel prices upward and introduced turbulence into global supply chains that had only recently begun to stabilize after years of pandemic-era disruption and the shockwaves from the war in Ukraine. For most Western audiences, the Strait of Hormuz is a story about oil prices, about potential military escalation between Iran and its adversaries, about the cost of filling a tank at a gas station. For Africa, and particularly for the landlocked economies of the Sahel, it is something more immediate and more punishing. Burkina Faso does not have a coastline. It does not have refineries. It is almost entirely dependent on imported fuel, which travels overland through supply chains that already carry significant costs and risks, routes that pass through fragile regions, cross multiple borders, and are subject to the pricing pressures of every disruption that occurs anywhere in the global energy system. When fuel prices rise globally, they do not rise equally. They rise fastest and hardest in places where supply chains are longest, where state subsidies are thinnest, and where currency reserves are most limited. Burkina Faso, in its current political and economic configuration, sits at the intersection of all three of those vulnerabilities. The practical effects are already being observed across import-dependent economies in West Africa. Fuel costs for transport, for agriculture, for the generators that many businesses and households rely on in the absence of stable electricity grids. All of these are moving upward. For farmers already stressed by conflict and climate volatility, an increase in transport and input costs is not an abstraction. It is a direct threat to livelihoods and food security. For small businesses in cities like Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, higher energy costs compress margins in an economic environment that was already offering very little room. What makes this moment particularly consequential is the simultaneity of the pressures. Burkina Faso, and the Sahel more broadly, is not confronting a single crisis. It is navigating a compounding crisis, where political transformation, security instability, altered aid and trade relationships, and now an externally generated economic shock are all operating at the same time on the same population, with very limited institutional capacity to absorb the blows. This is where the geopolitical ambition of the Alliance of Sahel States, the political bloc formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in the wake of their respective coups and their joint departure from ECOWAS, meets its most serious test. The bloc was formed on the language of sovereignty and mutual defense. Its leaders speak of a new African integration built on dignity rather than dependency. But sovereignty without economic resilience is brittle, and the ability to withstand external economic shocks is not created by political declarations. It requires infrastructure, diversified trade, regional production capacity, and institutional depth that take years, often decades, to build. None of those things exist yet, and the clock is not pausing. The pressure from the Strait of Hormuz disruptions, combined with the ongoing costs of the security situation, is creating a fiscal environment in Burkina Faso and its neighbors that is genuinely alarming to development economists monitoring the region. Budget deficits are widening. The ability to finance public services, schools, health facilities, the basic functions of a state, is being squeezed. The governments involved have been explicit about reducing their dependence on Western financial institutions and the conditionalities that come with them. But alternative financing, whether from Russia, from Gulf states, or from China, comes with its own terms and its own timelines. The gap between old dependencies and new alternatives is a real and dangerous space to occupy. There is a broader question here that Africa's political watchers are beginning to ask more directly. Can the model of political sovereignty that Traore and his allies are constructing survive the economic gauntlet it is now entering? It is one thing to expel French forces and build regional alliances in a period of relative stability. It is another to do so while your population faces rising fuel costs, entrenched insecurity, reduced aid flows, and the accumulated pressures of years of conflict displacement. The answer to that question will not be resolved in weeks or even months, but the conditions under which it plays out are being set right now, and the window for building the economic foundations that political ambition requires is narrowing with each new external shock. What is worth acknowledging, however, is that the alternative, staying within the old system, accepting the exile mechanism, remaining within ECOWAS under the political conditions being offered, maintaining the French security presence, was not without its own profound costs. The countries of the Sahel did not arrive at military governance as a result of stability and prosperity. They arrived there after decades of governance that was formally democratic but functionally extractive, after security partnerships that failed to contain insurgencies, after economic arrangements that kept them structurally dependent. The critique of the current governments is not wrong, but the critique of what preceded them is also not wrong. This is the honest complexity of the moment, and it is why observers who dismiss the current political transformation in the Sahel as simply a return to authoritarianism, or who celebrate it uncritically as a revolutionary dawn, are both failing to see clearly. What is emerging is something genuinely new and genuinely uncertain. A regional bloc of countries governed by young military leaders, explicitly aligned against the French-led post-colonial order, building security and political ties with Russia while attempting to define a new relationship with China and the Gulf, all while confronting a jihadist insurgency that continues to claim territory and lives, and now absorbing an economic shock from a crisis in the Persian Gulf that their governments had no hand in creating and have very limited tools to manage. That is the real situation, not a clean narrative, not a hero's journey, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of military rule. A genuinely complicated, genuinely high-stakes political experiment being conducted in real time, on real people, in some of the most difficult conditions on Earth. The reported treatment of Damiba, the exiled predecessor allegedly working against his country, the regional pressure that reportedly followed, the apparent response from Togo, is one chapter in this story. A chapter that suggests the men currently running Burkina Faso are not passive actors waiting for history to judge them. They are making choices, including choices about the rules of the game itself, and they are making them with an urgency that reflects their awareness of just how narrow the margin for error actually is. Whether those choices will add up to something lasting, something that genuinely changes the terms of political life in the Sahel for the generation that follows, depends on factors that no single government, however ideologically committed, can control alone. It depends on whether the security situation can be stabilized. It depends on whether economic alternatives to Western dependency can be built fast enough to matter. It depends on whether the regional solidarity of the alliance of Sahel states holds when the pressures on each member government become most intense. It depends on whether the global economic environment, including the ripple effects of whatever happens next around the Strait of Hormuz, allows any space for fragile states to build rather than simply survive. And it depends in a way that is rarely discussed openly, but that matters enormously, on whether the populations of these countries, the farmers, the traders, the young people in cities who rallied behind these governments with genuine enthusiasm, retain the belief that the hardship being asked of them is in service of something real. That belief is not indefinitely renewable. Sovereignty is a powerful idea. It is not, by itself, a substitute for electricity, affordable fuel, and security in your own neighborhood. This is what makes the current moment in the Sahel, and in Burkina Faso specifically, something that deserves serious, sustained analytical attention, not as a regional curiosity, not as a simple morality play about cool leaders and their international backers, but as a genuine test case for whether African states can exit the post-colonial system not just rhetorically, but structurally, economically, and durably. The world has seen many declarations of independence in Africa. It has seen far fewer successful constructions of genuine independence. The difference between the two has always come down to whether the political will and the economic foundations were built simultaneously, whether the words were backed by systems that could survive the inevitable shocks. Right now, in Burkina Faso and across the alliance of Sahel states, the words are forceful, the will appears genuine, and the shocks are arriving ahead of schedule. What happens next could redefine not just the Sahel, but the entire framework through which Africa's relationship with global power is understood and negotiated. The exile system may be under pressure. The neo-colonial maintenance architecture may be cracking. But cracks are not collapses. And the forces that built that architecture over decades have not simply conceded the field because a 30-something captain in Ouagadougou decided to demand different terms. The real question, the one that the next 2 to 5 years will begin to answer, is whether this generation of African leaders has not just the courage to challenge the old system, which has been demonstrated, but the capacity to build something that outlasts them. Something that doesn't depend on any one figure, doesn't collapse when the next shock arrives, and doesn't simply reproduce in new form the dependency it's set out to replace. That is a much harder thing to achieve than a coup. It always has been. And the Strait of Hormuz, indifferent to the politics of the Sahel, is already testing whether the foundation is there.